Well, welcome everybody. We'll give people a few minutes to join. Really appreciate those who arrived on time. That's always nice. Um, this is the webinar on climate change in the national media and Canadian media. And we're really excited to dive into some of the findings and also spend some time on what it means for communicators and advice that we can take away. Um, Again, while we're waiting for people to join, I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. And we're also curious what your go-to media sources for climate news in Canada. My name is Amber Bennett, and I will be hosting today's webinar. The first part of the webinar will address the findings of the report, and then we'll wrap up with some time for questions. So again, please take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from, and also please, we're curious what your go-to source for climate news is in Canada. So again, I'm Amber Bennett, and I'm joining from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda, and the Métis Region 3, otherwise known as Calgary. And I think we have a packed agenda, so we're just going to dive in. A few housekeeping notes before we start. I can't imagine anybody has not been on a Zoom webinar in the past year, but just in case, we'll be using the Q&A function for questions. And so we'll be tracking and addressing them through that. I encourage you to ask your questions as they come up using that. And then, we have a very broad and diverse spectrum of people on the call today. So I know that there are a number of researchers and people who are actually experts in this topic. So if you have information or resources that you'd like to share, please pop them in the chat and we'll be collecting those, and we can circulate them once the webinar is over with a copy of the report that we'll be going through. If you have any technical issues, you can text the two numbers that are on the screen. And then also at the end of the webinar, there will be a feedback survey that pops up, and we really depend on your feedback to understand kind of what more you might be interested in, how we did, of course, and to kind of keep this conversation moving forward. I think the only thing I'd like to do is just acknowledge that this webinar is being hosted by the Climate Narratives Initiative, Climate Access, and supported through the Clean Economy Fund. And I know that there are also a number of funders on this call. And so a shout out to you for supporting this work, and also the work of many of the organizations that are on this call. It's critical, and we appreciate that. So I think without further ado, we're going to kick things off. And first, we'll start with a quiz. We always like to test people's knowledge, and then we'll introduce our speakers and move in. So Maria, my colleague, is going to walk us through a few polls, which are some of the surprising findings that we found. So Maria, over to you.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. My name is Maria Granados. I'm the community lead for the Climate Narratives Initiative and working closely with Climate Access to bring you these events today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch into the poll here. So you should be able to see it. There's 3 questions in the poll. Just be sure to scroll down to the end of the screen so that you're able to submit your answers. But the first, so I'll just give you guys a couple of minutes to read through the questions, go through them, and then we'll share some of the findings here. I always love seeing all of the answers pop up. Got about 60% of people who have answered so far. Just go through a couple more seconds here. Alrighty, I am going to end the poll here since most of us have answered now. All right, so from the poll, we have climate action is most frequently framed as being, most of you are saying bad for the economy. Let's see what we have here. So actually what we found is climate action is most frequently framed as being good for the economy. In fact, positive economic framing is more than 3 times as common as negative in the analysis that we found. So that's always a fun and pleasant surprise. What are the most commonly cited climate solutions in the national media? We have carbon pricing and policy, renewable energy and electric vehicles, planting trees and recycling. So actually, the most commonly cited climate solutions were renewable energy and electric vehicles. And my colleague Chris will get into some of the other solutions that we found to be commonly cited in the media. And then finally, the percentage of coverage that casts out on climate science or negatively frames climate action, it's actually only 7% of coverage that casts out. So the good news is that the framing is overwhelmingly positive. And I am surprised that we had a lot of just different answers, but I will pass the presentation over to Chris to get us started here.
Before Chris jumps in, I'd like to formally introduce him. Many of you will know him, but we actually have 2 amazing speakers today. We have both Chris Hatch and Kara Pike. Chris is a communication strategist. Some of you, if you haven't already subscribed to his new newsletter, Zero Carbon, you might want to do that through the National Observer. It's really an amazing weekly roundup of news and research culture, all related to climate. So if that was not your go-to source for climate news, you might want to think about that. Chris is the former executive editor of the National Observer and the former executive director of the Rainforest Alliance. So he is the lead author in the report, and we're really pleased to have him go through this with us. And also we have Kara Pike, who is a pioneer and a climate communications expert. She's the executive director of Climate Access, and many of you know her through her the work that she has done through that organization, as well as leading many of Canada's top organizations around climate comms. So I will hand it over to you, Chris. And just to reiterate, we'll be using the Q&A for collecting questions as they come up. I really encourage you to put your questions in, and we'll be using the chat to share information. Many of you work in this field, and so we'll be collecting those resources and circulating them to participants. And also, if you haven't done so already, please introduce yourself. It's always super fun to see people all around the country who have joined and come together. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Amber. I'm coming to you from Vancouver, the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And got several interesting findings for you. I'm going to show you just quickly how we came to them, so you know what we're talking about. We were looking at the national media published in English, and we looked at the Globe, the CBC, the Star, the National and Financial Post, and Maclean's from the this spring, January 1st to March 24th, we cut it off deliberately before the Supreme Court decision on carbon pricing because we wanted to give you a basic practical sense of the landscape you're operating in that's not torqued by any particular event. We found 1,554 results, stories that are about climate or mention climate. And we selected at random 200 of them for a more detailed analysis. So you'll be seeing today the results of both the sort of broad sweep and that detailed analysis. Couple of limitations. Oh, sorry. There we go. We were looking at national outlets operating in English, so you're not getting provincial and regional results. And we were looking at, we did the study online, but we were looking at what used to be called print outlets. So you're not going to get social media narratives, radio, television, although we did do a quick and dirty contrast with global and CTV, and the results hold across those outlets as well. And notably, we did include wire services like Canadian Press, Reuters, Associated Press, where those are published by the national outlets. This turned out actually to be quite important part of the coverage. And it's something that when you look through the report, you'll see that Professor Sean Holman from Mount Royal, who I believe is on the call today, provided a reaction commentary, and something he really drilled into is the extent to which Canadian outlets are really relying on wire services. And we can come back to that in the Q&A if you would like. So let's dive in. What's the landscape look like? Well, no big shock. COVID absolutely stomped every other topic this spring. That's just the environment we're operating in. Keep an eye on that healthcare bar, because in the next slide, we look at issues beneath COVID. And what we found is that climate change is actually a pretty significant topic in the national media. It's lower than healthcare, which is of course always important to Canadians, especially during COVID, lower than the economy and hockey, but higher than pipelines, than unemployment, than childcare. And remember that this is the period in which, of course, Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. It was the lead up to the federal budget focused on childcare. Unemployment, of course, was a huge issue during COVID. So climate change is perhaps not as big an issue in the media as it needs to be, but it's also not nearly as small an issue as at least I would have feared. Are all the stories about climate change? No, about 50-50 of the stories referencing climate change are actually focused specifically on various aspects of climate change. Another half are about another issue in which climate change comes up. So that's actually also encouraging in its way, because it suggests that climate is really starting to permeate all kinds of coverage. Then we dove into the the broad frames, and this is taking us back to the poll. What you remember from the poll that actually only 7% of national media stories are framed as against climate action or casting doubt on climate science. It was pretty surprising to me. I expected the number against to be higher and the number neutral to be much higher as well. What we found is that almost 80% of stories are framed positively. Now, let's remember we're talking about frames here. So it's not to say that reporters or stories are actively cheerleading for climate action or promoting climate science explicitly. It can be, frames are often invisible and intangible. They're sort of what is taken for granted, what is considered inevitable. And we base this analysis looking at, the overall frame that a story takes, what kinds of quotes are, are selected to be presented, and that kind of thing. And 80% almost accept climate action as inevitable or better, or as a positive thing. And in fact, where the media looks at economic impacts specifically, we found another surprising finding that much more often than not, climate action is framed as being generally good for the economy. It's actually relatively rare now to have stories that are outright framed as climate action is bad for the economy. And I know that you probably see a lot of opinion pieces in your news feeds that are very provocative about how climate action is going to trash the economy, or even casting doubt on climate science. But in percentage terms, these are actually starting to be very, very small. So we dug into exactly what kinds of frames are being used more specifically. And what you find looking through this slide is that the top frame, is policy. Next comes economics. Then we're looking at energy issues. We're looking at politics and horse race, election kinds of politics. The big takeaway here is that it's very sterile. The issues, the kinds of frames that the media is using are not, there's no urgency, there's no moral imperative. In fact, less than 30% of the time is climate presented as something that impacts people. Most of these issues are quite technical, not so interesting to regular humans. So while there's a fair lot of coverage is quite overwhelmingly positive, we found that it's also not being presented as an urgent moral imperative. Here we dig into the most prominent topics. So we're getting away from the intangible frames and more into specifically what subjects the national media is drilling into. It kind of tracks the frames somewhat in that the top, the biggest topics are, politics, energy, what's going on in the United States, targets and emissions, the oil and gas industry. So again, a fairly sterile conversation. It's not being presented as an urgent moral imperative or as something that impacts people. Sorry, the slides are jumping ahead here, folks. And I don't seem to be able to control them. There we go. We did look at messengers and people referenced. One thing to note here is that although the slides are just jumping. Maria, do you think you could take control of them? One thing that you notice here is that Justin Trudeau is by far and away the most commonly mentioned Canadian person. Come back to international in a second. But remember that we're talking about over 1,500 stories. So it's actually quite diffuse. There's no messenger that dominates half the stories or anything like that. What you see from this list is that, as you might expect from a heavily policy-focused conversation, politicians are the most common quoted or referenced individuals. And one thing we really wanted to pull out and make note of here is that these are all white men for the most part, where, as we all know, women make up the most mobilized and important part of the audience. So that's something that Kara will be coming back to in just a moment. In fact, the first woman to break the ceiling is Greta Thunberg, who gets quoted or referenced more often than any female politician, any environmental group or think tank or company. Now, I mentioned off the top that we're looking at a period in which Joe Biden was inaugurated, and there's actually a huge amount of American coverage. If we include the American messengers and references, this is what things look like. Joe Biden actually way outpaces Justin Trudeau, and John Kerry was as likely to be quoted as Jonathan Wilkinson, more or less. I imagine most of you know that Kerry is Biden's global climate envoy, and Wilkinson is Canada's Minister for the Environment and Climate Change. So heavily American conversation. We don't know if this will continue as the bloom inevitably comes off the rose of the Biden administration, but we do know that sort of American contrasts are always a big deal for Canadians in general, and especially for the national media. So it is an important point of leverage. We also took a look on the next slide at specifically how Indigenous voice and issues are represented in the national media. What we found is that about 20% of renewable energy stories mention Indigenous issues or spokespeople, drops slightly 17% when stories are about pipelines or the broader oil and gas industry. Within overall climate coverage, the figure falls to about 14%, which is, of course, very low. But remember that the messengers are very diffuse. So that's actually not far off the amount of coverage that references Justin Trudeau, for example. Now, in the last couple of slides, we'll look at how fossil fuels and solutions get presented. One thing to know is that the energy transition is very widely accepted and typically framed positively. But transition is one of the really squirrely topics and frames in the national media. It is often presented in a way that undermines urgency. That's especially true in regard to fossil fuel production and fossil fuel use, but it's true more broadly as well. So it's very common to hear spokespeople saying things like, this is going to be a transition, meaning everyone, chill out. Or in the context of oil and gas production, that we will be using oil and gas for decades to come, which is a frame that suggests there's just no other way of looking at this issue and really kind of closes off debate. We did find, though, that climate, stay on that last one, please, is penetrating coverage. Most stories about the fossil fuel industry are about the business of the industry and its operations, but a significant minority now do mention climate. So what we found is that climate comes up in about 1/3 of stories about the oil sands, 1/4 of stories about pipelines, and interestingly now, 25% of the time that the national media is talking about investment in oil and gas, they're talking about climate in that context. We also finally found that there's really no distinction in terms of narratives in the national media. There's no distinction between having an oil and gas industry and expanding that industry, and almost no coverage at all about deliberately winding down production. Now, when we go to solutions, more specifically, you see here that Tesla is covered more frequently even than electric vehicles in general. The second most common, the second most common is renewable energy. And for those of you communicators, we took a look at the actual language that the national media is using. Renewable energy is still, fairly far ahead of clean energy or green energy. That's just how the national media likes to present it. Seeing increasing coverage of net zero. In fact, I would bet that if we had looked at this a year ago, that would be almost nowhere on the chart. And really quite a lot on hydrogen. Hydrogen has jumped way into the conversation, ahead of carbon capture, trees, which is shorthand in the chart for nature-based solutions of all kinds, small modular reactors, and those kinds of things. As you look down the chart, you'll see that green recovery and stimulus and those kinds of issues were not a big part of the conversation at all. And in the last chart, I just want to bring your attention to one very interesting finding, which is that the solutions typically are discussed in the national media without a climate context at all. So, there's different schools of thought on this, and it probably depends a lot on the audience. On the one hand, in a polarized situation, you might be able to make a lot more progress in the dialogue about renewable energy, electric vehicles, various other issues, if it's not yoked to climate change. But on the other hand, we know from public opinion work that the public has a very poor understanding of what the transition pathway needs to look like in practical terms. And so it's probably the case that the national media is not helping that along, in the sense that they're really decontextualizing and divorcing climate from the solutions when they get into solutions. Now on to the final slide, just a bit of a wrap up. Climate is fairly prominent, at least surprisingly to me, prominent, given that we're in the COVID situation, and less than healthcare or the economy, but more than issues like unemployment and childcare. The framing is surprisingly positive. Almost 80% of stories now just accept climate action as something that's inevitable, something that has to happen. And just 7% of coverage is actively, aggressively framed as casting doubt on the science or taking action on climate at all. But despite that, the national media coverage is very sterile. This is a policy conversation, an economics conversation, a political conversation, an energy conversation. It's not presented as something that's relevant to people's lives or as an urgent moral imperative. That, coming back to that narrative around transition, something that really popped out to us is how often, on the one hand, transition is framed very positively, and in that sense, we're sort of over a divide. It's taken for granted that we're going to make a transition to cleaner energy, but the way it's presented in narrative is often undermines urgency, which feeds back into that sort of sterile, non-urgent conversation more generally. And that final finding that renewable energy and electric vehicles, quite a lot of coverage, and strangely divorced from climate change. So those are some of the big takeaways that really surprised or jumped out at me. And I am going to hand over now to Kara, who's going to walk through some of the implications for communicators and practitioners in the climate field.
Great, thanks, Chris. And nice to see everyone. I'm joining you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Cowichan on Vancouver Island. And I'm gonna walk through some of the recommendations for communicators based on the analysis. So just to mention, Maria, if you could move the slides forward, that'd be great. So Chris talked about the conversation right now is technical, it's dry, it's not about people. So we really need to make it about people, increase urgency, and inject values. Part of this is really just repeating that climate change is getting worse and we have to get ahead of this. And that we're falling behind. Our emissions are going up. Others are making more progress, and we know we can do better. And also the need for a plan that we have, you know, a lot of communities in Canada, a lot of Alberta, really dependent on oil and gas. And so we need actually a plan so that we're not left behind. And then that moral imperative that Chris was talking about, so, you know, it really does resonate to, you know, this is a big challenge that's calling on all of us to act for ourselves now and for the future, and to protect what is amazing about Canada, our amazing nature and environment. And that caring for people, caring for others, caring for those most impacted by climate change, fossil fuels, and as I mentioned, those communities that are most impacted. It's also really important that we clarify what is the transition pathway. As Chris mentioned, there's no clarity on this, so moving ahead to the next slide. And it's really about the how now. And I think it's really interesting because with the release of the International Energy Agency's recent report that actually said we can't have any more fossil fuels, it is changing the conversation. So our analysis looked past, but in speaking recently with my colleague, Natalie Southworth, who's a media consultant, she said when she's talking to reporters now, it is all about the how. So yes, we need to get off oil and gas. It's that along with our plans for expanding them, our biggest challenge when it comes to climate change. And it's time to actually clarify that. And I think the how is really important for us to get ahead on because, you know, those who want to keep the status quo are already moving into that area. So that net zero conversation, net zero is kind of a confusing term anyway to most people, but it also is quickly being used as a way to, now obviously these commitments are exciting and some people are going to move forward on them, but there's a lot going on, in particular with oil and gas interests, using the net zero conversation in order to continue to produce at the current levels and expand, which we know we can't do if we want to stay to 1.5 degrees. And saying that they're going to get to net zero through strategies such as carbon capture and storage, which we just know is not proven to get us to where we need to go. And as I mentioned in the previous points about injecting values, really making sure that when we are talking about this shift, and I actually like the word shift better than transition, it's a little bit punchier, more active, that we are talking about making sure there's support for workers, funds to help to support them to move into new industries, training, funds for expanding new economic opportunities. So really important that we think about who is going to be left behind in this shift and making sure that they're being taken care of and that the solutions are accessible to everyone, including, again, those who have been most impacted by climate change and fossil fuels. Canada, we don't necessarily like or need to be number one in the world. That's not our persona, but we don't really like to be laggards either. And as Chris mentioned, we do really care about the US in particular, to some extent Europe, in terms of where others are at in the progress. And we're falling behind. And we're falling behind when it both comes to reducing emissions as well as expanding into renewable energy. So really pointing some of those examples out, like there's more clean energy in the state of Texas and in all of Canada. So moving ahead to the next slide. You know, I think this comes back to the urgency. And as Chris mentioned, the point about the solutions are disconnected from climate change. We do know that people are very concerned about extreme weather and the changes that we're now all unfortunately living in our lives. So it's really important to make sure we're referring to the fact we're experiencing more floods, fires, extreme storms, and communities all across the country. And what actually is driving this is fossil fuels. So yeah, we want to prepare increased resilience for those impacts, but let's get to the root of the problem so that the impacts don't get worse. And pivoting then to those tangible solutions. So connecting the dots from the risk, extreme weather increasing because of climate change, to what that pathway is to get away from oil and gas and other high climate pollution activities to the kind of healthy, safe quality of lives that we want. And then, you know, it's amazing when you think about how this issue impacts every single person, and it's only white men and mostly political leaders getting picked up in the national media. So how can we inject other voices? And I think it's really important in this sense, not to think about co-opting other voices. There are a lot of people out there actively talking about climate change. And so how do we amplify their stories? How might we support organizations or those on the ground facing more impacts to actually get their voices out, whether that's with funding or partnerships or that type of thing. Bring in the women. We need some women talking about this more. Because when you think about, I mean, Greta Thunberg now is a woman, but she was given that task and she rose into that position as a child, right? So we really need to think about how do we bring other strong female voices into the conversation. And just then always recognizing that the messengers need to be relevant to the audiences you're trying to reach. And on that note, I was noticing in the chat a comment about how much do people even go to national media for information on climate change? How influential is it when it comes to Canadians? I think it's extremely important for decision makers in the policy realm. So we do need to be thinking about how we can influence the conversation at that level. But I think that's a very fair point that, you know, that the more regional, local media is really critical, social media, and can often be a better way to broaden out beyond that sort of influencer audience. And I just wanted to make a note that following this work, we will be moving into analysis of looking at media at the different levels and social media as well. So I will leave it at that and turn it over to Amber, where I think we're going to get into some Q&A now.
Thanks, Kara. Well, you actually answered some of the questions already that were on the board. Maria, if you want to minimize the presentation, that'd be great. So Chris, there's a couple questions that are just around methodology. And I thought maybe we could answer those quickly. So one is around if we disaggregated the findings through different sources. I think this is a question around, you know, kind of pro-climate versus not. So if you could answer that. And at the same time, someone asked a question around Justin Trudeau and whether we were looking at the sentiment of his quotes. So if you could just maybe talk a little bit about how we did that analysis, that would be great.
Yeah, well, in terms of disaggregating the media outlets, it's quite interesting actually that there's not as big a difference as at least I would have expected. So I would have gone into this expecting Post media papers, for example, to be significantly less positively framed than the others. And they are only a little bit, actually. National Post, for example, came out almost 70% positive frame on stories, you know, where the others were closer to 80%. So there's definitely a difference, and it's definitely the case that Post media is really almost the only place you find kind of virulently negative coverage. It's mostly opinion coverage. You know, it's the Rex Murphys and Lawrence Solomons, et cetera, that they're still platforming. But as a percentage amount, it's quite small even in those outlets. So, you know, this does bring us back to the point Sean Holman had made, which is that a lot of climate coverage is wire services. So, you know, National and Financial Post, for example, republish a lot of Bloomberg, a lot of Associated Press, Canadian Press, and those are generally more positive than the outlets even themselves. Yeah, so, and what was the other methodological question? Was it about Trudeau?
Yeah, it was about, did we analyze the sentiment of his quotes? So he was, you know, more highly quoted.
Yeah, quoted or referenced. We rolled those things together. So it could just be that it's a story about the politics of climate change, and they're talking about the Trudeau government, you know, has done X or Y. Yeah, sentiment very positive. You know, you find quite a few where he's quoted. It's the quotes are almost always, you know, positive frames around Canada moving forward. This was a ton of coverage around the US, and Trudeau was very frequently quoted, you know, talking about things like, yes, the US is starting to act, they're going to catch up to where we've been for a long time, kinds of messages. In the report itself, you'll see we pull out sample narratives for each of these kinds of chapters that are really common. And yeah, that's Trudeau, I think, in the media disaggregator.
Thanks. I think there's an excellent question here from Etienne, and it might also get to what you're asking about Laura as well. This one I'll ask you, Kara, if you could answer. How do we get to, in communication strategy or terms, the idea of putting forward more local voices, more connected stories linked to human experiences? Laura asked about kind of more emotional stories or more emotional narratives. And at the same time, communicate the imperative or the urgency around the types of, you know, policies and solutions that are required at a large scale. Is that clear, Kara?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a balance, and you know, we need to be direct about the scale of the challenge. And that can be overwhelming for people, but there's actually a lot of evidence in social science that in order for people to really move through a process of understanding risk, accepting it, and acting, that you do have to look the cold, hard truth right in the face and see the scale, the magnitude of the challenge. So I think it is, you know, important just to be, so there's an emotion around that urgency, right? It's like this, we're at this crossroads. We have less than 9 years to act. It's got to be now. But I think we also have to mirror that with hope and what's possible. And this is the problem with the climate change and impacts and the solutions conversations being separate, because they really need to be connected in order for people to, you know, we need to be real about the scale of the challenges, they said, but then if you don't have that hope and possibility, people can get really stuck there in that emotion versus moving on to empowerment. When it comes to local voices. You know, I think again, there are quite a few folks out there we know from the network that we're working with of more than 1,200 folks who are all out there actively trying to communicate about climate change from all different sectors and a lot of folks at the local level. So there's a lot going on. And I think part of it, and it goes back to the supporting and amplifying, like how do we really direct resources so those with that local authority, with strong social connections, are really feeling empowered and activated to really be owning, like, you know, engaging with their networks. And I think this is again where we need to get the conversation out of the media and between people, because we know people aren't necessarily talking to their friends, family about this, but they can be as influential as anyone. And so, you know, there's a lot of, for example, different types of ambassador programs out there happening at the local level, whether it's nonprofits or local governments who are calling on people in the community who care and equipping them with tools and resources and training to go out there and mobilize people on climate action, better understand the relevance of risks, and really reach beyond those who really are in the choir right now. And I think that's one of the benefits of that local kind of engagement. So those are just some thoughts for that.
Thanks. And
I would add one more actually.
Yeah,
as well. One of the things I wished I had highlighted in the presentation flows nicely from what Kara was saying, is that in terms of injecting urgency, it's actually the case in a lot of the coverage that even the quotes, or when the reporter to advocates or the critics, that lacks urgency. So it's very, very common, for instance, to see a story about, you know, the federal government is doing blah, blah, blah. Critics say this will make it impossible to meet our targets, you know, and it's sort of understandable why, you know, the critics would frame it that way, because it's a policy conversation. And so targets are important, but for the general public doesn't really give a crap about our targets, you know? So there are a lot, I think, of opportunities, even within the policy conversation, to make it a more, a less sterile criticism.
Great. And I would just add one last point on this. I think a part of what allows us to face the scope and the scale of the problem and the truth is by touching into what it is that we love. And so those local stories that are about the things that we love, that are being impacted, that will have changes, it is important to tell those stories, to connect to what people know and love and value and want to protect, in order to kind of move through the process of looking at the problem. So that's also, I think, important here. So there is a great conversation, or a great question here from Louise, who I would shout out, who actually ran a really interesting campaign for the love of, that helps kind of talk about and build on these kind of principles. She asks that transition talk within policy, politics, economy, technology is consistent with and not confronting the growth capitalism, consumerism dominant paradigm. When we say insert the moral values dynamic, what do we mean exactly? Too often it's tied to urgency, angry tone, seen as emotional, whereas the dominant paradigm is rational. So urgency is seen as emotional. The dominant paradigm is seen as rational. You know, other than care, can you share more on what we mean by this kind of moral values framing? I feel like, Louise, you could probably answer this for us, but Kara or Chris, do either of you have anything to add around this idea of injecting values and injecting urgency, morals?
Well, we know now that climate change is the greatest threat facing humanity. It is the issue that threatens us now and into the future more than anything else you can think of. And so there's nothing, I think you can inject urgency without it being irrational, because that actually is a finding from the World Economic Forum and their annual survey of risks, and they've just done so for 2 years in a row. Climate change is worse than any other threat we face, and so there's an urgency around that, and there's a morality around responding to that, but it's still science-based. So, you know, I think you can balance it that way. And I'm probably going to go right back to something that I learned, you know, or Louise has been talking about, which is just, you know, there's been quite a lot of work now around testing climate emergency as a frame. And, you know, we're in a climate emergency. Let's start acting like it and using that as a simple test to challenge ourselves on what is adequate climate leadership at this time. So good for us for putting, you know, carbon pollution pricing in place, but that's not enough in a climate emergency if we keep it producing and expanding fossil fuels, the biggest source of the pollution driving that threat to humanity. So I kind of turn it back to you, Louise.
Thanks, Kara. A question here, Chris, from Jody Stark. How do we think we should talk about a just transition in a way that centers equity broadly rather than just supporting getting oil workers new jobs?
Yeah, well, I would say that one of the first hurdles is, if we're talking about the national media, is getting that conversation in there at all, let alone how it gets played out. It's a little bit present as it relates to oil and gas workers and impacts, and maybe there's a need to do something. It's not yet at all present. I mean, statistically speaking, you know, practically speaking, in terms of the broader equity issues. The one exception that we touched on in the presentation, being Indigenous issues, are getting some play in the national media. So I think that it's part of the flipping the script on transition that Kara was talking about, that we can inject urgency into the transition. It's already happening. We're already behind the ball. We've got to move faster, like to inject urgency into the transition conversation, and then into the what. I think, you know, there's still quite a lot of work to do to get the national media talking about just transition for workers and communities. I think that one of the places where we broaden it to a more equity-based transition conversation is around health and around extreme weather and climate impacts more broadly. As we make that more of a focus, and as health is starting to be more of a focus, and I think that's one of the natural ways to broaden the equity of impacts and need for equity in transition. It's also been a fairly big part of the American conversation. So, you know, again, the potential there to kind of piggyback in and you know, use contrast messaging. You know, the Biden administration is spending 40%, you know, of its climate spending through an equity lens, and Canada's not. Those kinds of things.
Thanks, Chris. We have about
I would love to jump into that quickly. So one of the next things that our team is going to be working on, thanks to a partnership with the Global Strategic Communications Council, is some message testing around this transition language. So just wanted to flag that, and we'll be sharing that in some guidance as a result of that work. But you know, just transition comes out of the labor movement, and it's pretty well established what it means in that context, which is around workers. And I think we've expanded it and sort of to try and capture everything more broadly. I don't know whether or not it's tracking. Again, that's part of why we want to do that message testing. But I can say to some of the language that I've been using lately is more around a fair energy and economic transition, because just transition assumes understanding, you know, what it is you're talking about. And if you don't have that connection back to where that term comes from, perhaps you're not going to be quite as clear. And I think Canadians tend to respond to things being fair, maybe not expecting things might be just, but they should be fair. But again, that's something we're going to be testing. And I think there's different ways then you can talk about that fair energy and economic transition and tie it to different people or geographies. So we want to make sure that no one is left behind in this fair energy and economic transition, including Indigenous communities, communities that have been on the front lines of fossil fuels, communities and people facing the greatest impacts from climate change, young people, so that they're not left behind and they have a future and economy that's going to be competitive with the US and others in the world. So I think we need to be careful about relying on just transition versus being more explicit about what we mean by that and what are some of the types of things that should be in place in order for the shift to actually happen in.
Thanks, Kara. And I'll just point out a remark that Trevor Melanson from Clean Energy Canada added in the chat. And so his new favorite word is reality. And so I think this builds on what Kara was talking about, that really for a long time, oil and gas kind of owned the realistic narrative versus idealistic in terms of the urgency question. And they're releasing a report tomorrow. Shout out on the clean energy jobs, and they're flipping the script on that and talking about it is only realistic that we transition away from fossil fuel into clean energy jobs. So keep your eye out for the release of that report and look at some of the ways in which they're talking about it. I think for now, that is enough, or that's all the time we have right now. We will be sending out the report along with a copy of this recording. We have a few other resources that will include, some of which came up here in the chat. I'd also like to draw your attention to another event that we have happening next week. I think someone in the chat also mentioned that they would like to have more regular sessions like this talking about messaging networks. And so one of the events that we have happening next week is around engaging women on climate. We know that they consistently surface as a really important audience. And so I'm very excited to say that we have some of the leading thinkers here in Canada and in the US who will be coming together next week. Maria has just placed the information for that in the chat, and we'll have both an opportunity to hear some of the research and thinking that's happening, but also to hear from campaigners who are doing research and work on the ground and what they're finding. So some Canadian partners, many of you who are on the call, as well as some of our US partners. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to check that out and to register. Thank you so much, Kara. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Maria, who did a lot of the research to bring us the report today. We'll be circulating that, and please keep an eye out for more conversations happening in the fall. Thanks, everybody, and have a good day.